The operating room was a world of its own, a place of cold, bright light and the steady, rhythmic beeping of machines that told you a heart was still beating. It was a place of life and death, and the man in charge, the lead surgeon, acted like a god in this small, sterile universe. He was famous in the hospital, famous for his incredible skill, for saving lives no one else could, but he was also famous for his temper. It was a scary, unpredictable thing like a sudden storm. The nurses and assistants who worked with him had learned to move carefully, to speak softly, to try and stay out of the path of his anger. On this day, the surgery was a difficult one, a complex procedure on a patient's heart. The tension in the room was thick, almost like a fog you could feel. The surgeon was more on edge than usual, his commands sharp and impatient. Every few minutes his voice would cut through the quiet concentration, criticizing someone, finding fault with a small, unimportant detail. In the middle of this stood a nurse. She was the lead nurse for this operation, a woman with calm, intelligent eyes and hands that never seemed to shake. She had been through this many times before. For years she had listened to this surgeon's insults, his harsh words. She had always told herself to just breathe, to focus on the patient, to remember that the most important thing was the person on the table. She would lock the hurt and the frustration away in a small box inside her heart and just do her job, which she did exceptionally well. The worst part of his anger was that it was never about real mistakes. It was about his need to control everything and everyone. This nurse was so good at her job that she could almost read the surgeon's mind, anticipating what tool he would need next, ready before he even asked. She was the steady ground everyone else in the room relied on when the surgeon's temper started to shake everything. The most critical part of the surgery was happening. All eyes were on the surgeon's hands. The nurse was focused, her entire being concentrated on the rhythm of the operation. The surgeon barked out a command, his voice rough. It was a command for a specific surgical clamp, but the way he said it was rushed and unclear. The nurse, following her training and experience, reached for one type of clamp. A half-second later, the surgeon snarled, "No, the other one. The angled one. Pay attention." She quickly put the first clamp down and picked up the correct one, passing it to him smoothly. There was no delay. The surgery had not been affected in any way. But for the surgeon, that half-second was a challenge to his authority. He took the clamp, his eyes glaring at her over his surgical mask. "Useless," he hissed. The word was like a slap in the face. It was loud, meant to be heard by everyone. It wasn't a comment on the action. It was an attack on her as a person. A deep silence fell over the operating room. The only sound was the steady beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. The other nurses and the assistant surgeon froze, their eyes darting between the surgeon and the nurse. They all waited, wondering what would happen next. They had seen this scene before, but it always felt just as shocking. The nurse felt a heat rise in her cheeks. She took a slow, quiet breath. For years she had taken this. She had swallowed her pride, bit her tongue, and remained silent. But something inside her had reached its limit. The box where she kept all the hurt was too full, and it finally broke open. She knew the rules. She knew the hierarchy. A nurse does not talk back to a surgeon in the operating room. But she also knew her own worth. She knew she was not useless. She was a highly skilled professional, and she deserved basic respect. The critical phase of the surgery was over. The patient was stable. The immediate danger had passed. She lifted her head and looked directly at the surgeon. Her voice when she spoke was calm and clear. It wasn't loud, but in the silent room every word was sharp and distinct. "My timing was correct, doctor," she said. "Your request was ambiguous. For a moment no one even breathed." The beeping of the monitor seemed to get louder. No one in the history of the surgeon's career had ever spoken back to him like that. No one had ever held up a mirror and shown him that he was the one at fault. The surgeon's eyes widened in pure, undiluted shock, which then quickly twisted into rage. This was more than just disobedience. It was a revolution in his kingdom. His authority, the thing he valued most, had been publicly questioned. The anger took over his whole body. His face turned a dark red. A thick vein bulged on his forehead. He took a sharp step towards her, closing the small distance between them. He was so blinded by his fury that he didn't think about the consequences, about the other people watching, about the cameras in the room. All he could see was a challenge that needed to be crushed. His hand, the same hand that performed life-saving miracles, snapped through the air. There was a sharp, loud crack as his palm connected with the side of her face. The sound echoed terribly in the quiet, sterile room. The nurse's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. A stinging pain spread across her cheek. But she didn't cry out. She didn't stumble. She simply stood there for a second, letting the shock wave pass through her. Then, with a dignity that left everyone else in the room feeling small, she slowly turned her head back to look at him. Her eyes met his, and in them there was no fear. There was only a cold, clear fire. It was a look that promised this was not over. Without saying another word, she turned around. She walked step by steady step towards the operating room's double doors. She pushed them open and walked out, leaving the stunned silence, the beeping machines, and the furious surgeon behind. The story of what happened began to spread through the hospital almost instantly, but the nurse herself was quiet. She was not interested in gossip. She was planning her next move. The slap on her face was already fading, but the fire in her eyes was only growing stronger. She knew this was a battle she could not afford to lose, not just for herself, but for every other person who had ever been made to feel small by someone in power. And she had a strength, a history, that the arrogant surgeon could never have guessed. The heavy, swinging doors of the operating room whispered shut behind the nurse. The moment she stepped into the bright, sterile hallway, the world outside the bubble of anger came back into focus. The quiet hum of the hospital, the distant sound of a pages being called, the rolling wheels of a medicine cart. It all felt strangely normal while her cheek still burned with the memory of the slap. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She walked with a steady, purposeful pace towards the staff lounge. Her mind, usually a checklist of patient care and medical procedures, was now perfectly clear, focused on a single goal. She knew exactly how these things usually went. She had seen it before. The powerful are often protected, and the ones who speak up are often pushed aside. Inside the lounge, it was empty. She went straight to the sink and splashed cold water on her face. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her cheek was red and the outline of fingers was beginning to show. She took a picture of it with her phone, her hand perfectly steady. This was not a moment of emotion anymore. It was a moment of evidence. Meanwhile, back in the operating room, the surgery was finished by the assistant surgeon. The atmosphere was heavy and awkward, like the air after a thunderstorm. No one knew what to say. The surgeon, now that his rage had passed, seemed to shrink a little. He finished up quickly, avoiding everyone's eyes, and left without a word. He went straight to his expensive office, closed the door, and poured himself a drink. He convinced himself he was the victim. In his mind, she had provoked him. She had challenged him in front of everyone, and he had to put her in her place. He felt a flicker of worry, but it was quickly smothered by his arrogance. They need me, he thought to himself. Who are they going to believe? A nurse or me? The news, of course, traveled fast. In a hospital, gossip moves quicker than any virus. By the end of the day, everyone from the cafeteria workers to the hospital administrators had heard a version of the story. He finally went too far, people whispered in the hallways. He actually hit her. There was a shared sense of anger among the nursing staff and many of the junior doctors. This was not just one incident. It was the final straw after years of bullying. The very next day, the nurse did not call in sick. She arrived at the hospital, her head held high. She went directly to the office of the hospital's head administrator. She walked in, sat down, and placed a folder on the desk. Inside was the photo of her injured face, a formal written statement of what happened, and the names of several people who were witnesses in the operating room. The head administrator was a man who had worked with the surgeon for a long time. They had gone to medical conferences together, shared meals. He listened to the nurse, his face looking more and more troubled. He promised her that the hospital took this very seriously. He used phrases like internal review and appropriate action. What happened next was exactly what the nurse had expected. The surgeon was called in. He was given a 2-week suspension, but it was a suspension with pay. It was like a forced vacation. The message from the administration was clear. They wanted this to go away quietly. They were hoping that a little time would let the dust settle, and everyone would just move on. The head administrator even called the nurse back into his office. "Look," he said in a gentle voice, trying to be the peacemaker. "He's under a lot of pressure. These high-stakes surgeries, tempers can flare. It was an unfortunate situation, but let's not ruin a brilliant career over one moment of poor judgment." The nurse listened politely. She nodded, and then she said, in that same calm, clear voice she had used in the OR, "This wasn't a moment of poor judgment. It was a choice, and I will not be a part of sweeping it under the rug." She knew that the hospital's internal process was not enough, so she started taking her own steps. She made an appointment with a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but a well-known lawyer who specialized in protecting the rights of employees. This lawyer was a fierce woman who listened to the nurse's story, looked at the evidence, and her eyes hardened. "We will make this right," she said. Together, they filed a formal complaint with the state medical board. This was a serious move. This wasn't just a hospital matter anymore. It was an official charge against the surgeon's medical license. The complaint used strong words: assault and unprofessional conduct. When the surgeon, sitting comfortably at home, received the notice from the medical board, he was furious. He threw the papers on his expensive marble kitchen counter. "How dare she?" he shouted to his empty house. He saw it not as a consequence of his actions, but as an attack. He was the star, the hero, and she was just a nurse trying to get famous or get a big paycheck. His own lawyer, a sharp man in an expensive suit, advised him to settle. "The evidence is not on our side," the lawyer said. "Let's make this go away quietly." But the surgeon refused. His pride would not allow it. He was convinced he could win. He believed in his own importance so much that he thought everyone else would see it his way too. A mediation meeting was scheduled. This is a meeting where both sides sit down with a neutral person to try and find a solution, without going to a full public hearing. The nurse and her lawyer sat on one side of the table. The surgeon and his lawyer sat on the other. The surgeon was cold and arrogant. He repeated his story. He talked about the immense pressure and how the nurse's insubordination had created a dangerous situation for the patient. He never once said he was sorry. He never once took responsibility. The nurse's lawyer simply took notes. Then she began to speak. She didn't just talk about the slap. She started talking about a pattern of behavior. She mentioned dates, times, and the names of other nurses and assistants who had been bullied and humiliated by this same surgeon over the years. She was building a case that showed this was not a one-time event. It was a culture of fear that he had created. The surgeon started to feel a little uneasy. This was bigger than he thought. Outside the hospital, whispers were starting to reach the public. A local news reporter got a tip about the story. She started making calls to the hospital's public relations department asking questions. The hospital administrators began to panic. Their plan for a quiet internal solution was falling apart. The pressure was building from two sides: the formal legal system and the threat of bad publicity. The surgeon, still on his paid vacation, started to feel the walls closing in. His phone wasn't ringing as much with calls from colleagues. When he went to his favorite coffee shop near the hospital, people he knew would look away. He was being isolated. The kingdom he had built was showing cracks. He was still confident that he was the most important person in this drama. But what he didn't know was that the woman he had hit was far stronger than he could ever imagine. She had a hidden strength, a history of facing real pressure that would soon turn his entire world upside down. The battle had only just begun, and he was already losing. The paid suspension, which the surgeon had first seen as a minor annoyance, began to feel less like a vacation and more like a quiet prison. The first few days were fine. He slept in. He played golf on a perfectly manicured course, the quiet thwack of the ball a soothing sound. But the silence around him grew louder. His phone, which usually buzzed constantly with calls from the hospital, colleagues and patients seeking his expertise, was strangely quiet. It was as if he had become a ghost. He tried to tell himself it was all nonsense, that the hospital couldn't function without him, that they would soon come crawling back, begging him to return for the complex surgeries only he could perform. He was the star player, and the game couldn't go on without him. But as the days turned into a week, a small, cold knot of doubt began to form in his stomach. Meanwhile, the nurse was not sitting still. With the support of her lawyer, she was building a case that was much bigger than just one slap. It was like she was pulling on a single loose thread, and an entire tapestry of bad behavior was beginning to unravel. Her lawyer sent formal letters to the hospital, not just about the assault, but about what they called a hostile work environment. This was a powerful legal term, and it made the hospital's lawyers very nervous. It meant that this wasn't just one bad day. It was a pattern that the hospital had allowed to continue for years. The nurse's lawyer started talking to other people who worked at the hospital. And once one person agreed to tell their story, others found the courage to speak up as well. It was like a dam had broken. A young intern, his voice shaking slightly over the phone, told a story about how the surgeon had thrown a surgical instrument at him in the operating room, missing his head by inches, all because he asked a simple question. A veteran nurse from a different department described how he had screamed at her in front of a patient's family, reducing her to tears, because a report was 5 minutes late. An anesthesiologist confirmed that the surgeon's temper was well known and was often a topic of worried discussion among the staff. Each story was collected, written down, and signed. Each one was another brick in a wall that was slowly being built around the surgeon. The nurse listened to these stories, her heart feeling heavy. It confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't about her. This was about a system that had allowed one man to bully and intimidate people for far too long. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them. Back at home, the surgeon's confidence was starting to crack. He received a formal letter from the hospital's legal department. It was dense with complicated language, but the meaning was clear. Because of the ongoing legal situation, his privileges to practice at the hospital were under review. He was no longer suspended with pay. He was now officially benched. His status was in limbo. He called his own lawyer, his voice tight with anger. What does this mean? Under review? I have patients. I have surgeries scheduled. His lawyer, a man who dealt in facts, not feelings, was blunt. It means they are covering themselves. The medical board is investigating. The nurse is suing. And now the news is sniffing around. The hospital is protecting the hospital. Right now, you are a liability. The word hit the surgeon like a physical blow. Liability. He had always been an asset, the most valuable player. To be called a liability was unimaginable. His lawyer continued. I strongly advise you to consider a settlement. We can offer the nurse a sum of money, a significant sum. In return, she drops the lawsuit with the medical board and agrees to a confidentiality clause. This all goes away. For the first time, the surgeon felt a flicker of real fear, but his pride was a stubborn beast. No, he snapped. I will not pay her a single dollar. That would be admitting I was wrong. I did nothing wrong. She is trying to destroy my career because her feelings got hurt. He decided to take matters into his own hands. He put on his best suit, the one he wore for important conferences, and drove to the hospital. He marched through the familiar hallways, his head high, expecting the usual nods of respect. But something had changed. People didn't meet his eyes. A group of young nurses he passed stopped talking and looked away as he walked by. The head of another surgical department, a man he had known for 15 years, saw him coming and quickly turned into a patient's room. He was being treated like he had a contagious disease. He finally reached the office of the head administrator, the man he considered a friend. The administrator's assistant looked flustered. I'm sorry, doctor, he's in a meeting. Then I'll wait, the surgeon said, his voice cold. He sat in the plush waiting area for over an hour. He could hear faint voices from behind the closed door. Finally, the door opened and the head administrator stepped out. He didn't look happy to see the surgeon. His face was pale and tense. Can we talk? The surgeon said, standing up. The administrator glanced around the empty waiting area. This isn't a good time. You shouldn't be here. This is ridiculous, the surgeon said, his voice rising. You know what really happened. You know how these people can be. Are you really going to let them do this to me? The administrator's expression was a mix of pity and frustration. It's out of my hands, he said quietly. The legal team is running everything now. And the board? The board is very concerned about the other stories that are coming out. He wouldn't meet the surgeon's gaze. You need to listen to your lawyer. You need to settle. With that, he turned and walked quickly back into his office, closing the door firmly. The surgeon stood there, alone in the quiet hallway. The reality of his situation finally crashed down on him. It wasn't just one nurse against him. It was the entire system he thought was on his side. The respect he had taken for granted was gone. The power he had wielded so freely had vanished. He was on the outside looking in. He walked back to his car, his steps slower and heavier than before. The fight was no longer about who was right or wrong. It was about survival, and for the first time in his life he was starting to feel like he was losing. The world he had built was crumbling, and he had no one to blame but himself. The quiet confidence of the nurse and the growing list of witnesses were a tide he could not hold back. The quiet in the surgeon's life was now complete. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a golf course, but the heavy, waiting quiet of a storm that is about to break. He stayed in his large, expensive house, the rooms feeling too big and empty. The phone calls had almost completely stopped. The invitations to speak at conferences were put on hold. The world of medicine, which had once celebrated him, was now turning its back. He tried to tell himself it was all a misunderstanding, a temporary problem. But late at night, lying awake in the dark, he could not escape the memory of the sound, the sharp, loud crack of his hand hitting her face. It replayed in his mind over and over. For the first time, he allowed himself a terrible thought. What if I was wrong? But that thought was too painful to hold on to for long. His pride would quickly push it away. He would get angry again, blaming the nurse for being difficult, blaming the hospital for being weak, blaming everyone but himself. Meanwhile, the nurse was preparing for the most important step yet. The hospital, feeling the pressure from the lawsuit and the medical board, had scheduled a final disciplinary hearing. This was not a private meeting behind closed doors. This was a formal proceeding in front of the hospital's full board of directors. They would listen to both sides and then make a final decision about the surgeon's future at the hospital. For the nurse, this was it. This was the moment where she would have to stand up and tell her story to the people who had the power to make a real change. She was not nervous. The fire that had been lit in the operating room had not gone out. It had grown into a steady, strong flame. She spent time with her lawyer, going over every detail, preparing for what she would say. The day of the hearing arrived. It was held in the hospital's main boardroom, a room with a long, polished wooden table and large windows that looked out over the city. The atmosphere was tense and serious. The board members, a group of serious-looking men and women in formal suits, sat at the table. They were business people and community leaders, and their main job was to protect the hospital's reputation. The surgeon arrived with his lawyer. He wore his best suit, trying to project an image of confidence and importance. But he looked thinner, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He sat down at one end of the long table, avoiding looking at the nurse, who sat calmly with her lawyer at the other end. The meeting began. The head administrator spoke first, his voice careful and formal. He explained the situation, calling it an unfortunate incident and talking about the need to balance all interests. Then, the hospital's head lawyer presented the facts from the hospital's investigation. He talked about the surgeon's long record of brilliant work, but he also had to admit that there were multiple reports of his harsh behavior. Then it was the surgeon's turn to speak. He stood up. He talked about the pressure of saving lives. He talked about the need for absolute focus in the operating room. He said that while he regretted the physical contact, it would never have happened if the nurse had not been openly insubordinate and created a risk for the patient. He pleaded with the board to see the bigger picture, to not throw away a career that had saved so many people over one single mistake. His voice was strong, but it had a desperate edge to it. When he finished, he sat down, believing he had done enough. He thought his reputation and his skills would be enough to save him. Then the nurse's lawyer stood up. She was calm and professional. She thanked the board for their time, and then she said, "The board has heard from the doctor. Now I would like you to hear directly from my client. She would like to read her victim impact statement." The nurse stood up. She did not look at the surgeon. She looked directly at the board members. She held a single piece of paper in her hand, but she barely glanced at it. Her words came from her heart. She began by talking about her work. "I have been a nurse for 15 years, she said, her voice clear and steady. "In that time, my only goal has been to care for my patients and to support the doctors I work with. I believe in the chain of command. I believe in respect." She then described what happened that day in the operating room. She did not shout or get emotional. She simply told the truth. She described the constant insults, the feeling of walking on eggshells, and then the moment he slapped her. "The physical pain faded," she said, "but the humiliation and the violation have not. He did not just hit me. He tried to hit my spirit. He tried to tell me that I was nothing." The board members listened intently. You could have heard a pin drop in the room, and then she paused. She took a slow breath and her tone changed. It became stronger, more powerful. "For 15 years I have served in this hospital," she said. "But for 7 years before that I wore a different uniform." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each board member. "I was a captain in the United States Army Nurse Corps." A ripple of surprise went through the room. The surgeon, who had been staring at the table, slowly lifted his head, his eyes wide. "I served 2 tours in a combat zone in Afghanistan," she continued, her voice gaining even more strength. "My job was to run a field hospital. Every day we worked while listening to the sound of rockets and gunfire. We had to make life and death decisions in seconds. We triaged soldiers, local citizens, even children with explosions happening nearby. We held the hands of dying young men and women who were far from their families. We did our jobs while being shot at." She let that sink in. The image she painted was so powerful, so different from the quiet of an operating room. "So, members of the board," she said, turning her gaze finally to the surgeon, her eyes locking onto his. "When Dr. Thorne speaks to me about pressure, I must tell you he knows nothing about pressure." Then she delivered the final, devastating blow. And he certainly should not have laid a hand on a soldier. For a moment, there was absolute, total silence in the boardroom. The revelation was like a thunderclap. The board members were stunned. They looked at the nurse with a new, profound respect. They saw her not as just a nurse, but as a veteran, a leader, a hero. The surgeon felt the world drop out from under him. His face went completely white. He felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. All his arguments, his talk of pressure and high-stakes environments, crumbled into dust in that instant. He hadn't just hit a nurse. He had assaulted a military officer who had faced down dangers he could not even begin to imagine. His arrogance in that moment seemed pathetic and small. He looked down at his hands, the hands he was so proud of, and for the first time he felt true, deep shame. The battle was over, and he had lost everything. His silence in the boardroom was heavy and full of meaning. It was a silence that said more than any words could. The board members looked at the nurse, and they no longer saw just an employee. They saw a person of immense strength and dignity. They saw a veteran who had served her country with courage. The surgeon's story about pressure in high-stakes environments now sounded hollow and foolish. The chairman of the board, an older man with a serious face, was the first to speak. He cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said to the nurse, and his voice was filled with a new respect. "Thank you for your statement and for your service." He then turned to the surgeon. "The board will now deliberate. We will call you back in with our decision." The surgeon stood up. His legs felt weak. He walked out of the boardroom without looking at anyone. His lawyer followed him, his face grim. They waited in a small, quiet side room. The surgeon did not speak. He just stared at the wall, the nurse's words echoing in his mind. He knows nothing about pressure. He felt a shame so deep it was like a physical pain. The wait was not long. Perhaps they had already made up their minds, and her revelation had only confirmed their decision. After about 20 minutes, they were called back in. Everyone took their same seats. The chairman looked directly at the surgeon. His expression was not angry, but it was firm and final. "This board has reached a decision," he began. "The assault on a staff member is an unacceptable violation of our hospital's most fundamental values. It cannot be excused by stress, by skill, or by any other reason. Furthermore, the testimony today has revealed a pattern of behavior that we, as an institution, should have addressed long ago. For that, we apologize." He took a breath. "Therefore, effective immediately, your employment with this hospital is terminated. Your privileges to practice here are permanently revoked. We will also be reporting this decision to the national database that all hospitals use, and we will fully support the state medical board in whatever disciplinary action they see fit." The words landed on the surgeon like blows. Terminated. Permanently revoked. His career, his identity, his entire life was over. He opened his mouth to say something, to argue, but no sound came out. There was nothing left to say. He had fallen from the top, and he had no one to blame but himself. The news spread through the hospital like wildfire. But this time the feeling was different. It wasn't just gossip. There was a sense of relief, and for many, a feeling of justice. Nurses and staff members who had walked on eggshells for years felt a weight had been lifted. They stood a little taller. A few weeks later, the state medical board announced its decision. The surgeon's medical license was suspended for 1 year. After that, If he wanted to ever practice medicine again, he would have to complete a long and rigorous course in anger management and professional ethics. It was a long road back, a road he would have to walk alone. The nurse, however, was not focused on his punishment. For her, this was never just about getting him fired. It was about making sure this never happened to anyone else. With a significant financial settlement from the hospital, she had the resources to make a real change. She decided to start a new organization. She called it the Safe Harbor Initiative. Its mission was simple but powerful: to provide free, confidential support and legal help to any healthcare worker who was facing bullying, harassment, or abuse in their workplace. She set up a phone line and a website. She reached out to nursing schools and hospitals, offering to give talks and workshops. She told her story, not with anger, but with a powerful calmness. She spoke about the importance of respect and dignity for every single person in a hospital, from the surgeon to the cleaning staff. She became a quiet but powerful voice for change. One day, several months later, she was walking through the hospital corridors. She was visiting a former colleague. As she passed the very operating room where everything had happened, she stopped for a moment. The doors were the same. The light above the door was on, showing a surgery was in progress, but something was different. On the wall beside the door there was a new small plaque. It listed the new rules of conduct for the operating room, rules that she had helped to write. The first rule was, every member of this team deserves respect. There will be no yelling, no insults, and no physical aggression. We are here for the patient, and we will act with professionalism and kindness. A young nurse was standing nearby, preparing to go in. She recognized the veteran nurse. She smiled, a warm, respectful smile. "Thank you," the young nurse said softly. The nurse simply nodded. She looked at the plaque and then at the closed doors. The memory of the slap was still there, but it no longer had power over her. She had taken that painful moment and used it to build something good, something that would protect others. She had not just won a battle against one arrogant man. She had started a quiet revolution. The culture of fear was being replaced by a culture of respect. All because one woman, a soldier and a nurse, had the courage to stand up and say, "No more." And in doing so, she had healed not just herself, but a part of the hospital itself. Her story became a legend, not of anger, but of strength and quiet dignity.